There is a logic in the sequence of the development of thought in the synthesis of yoga, which spans not only the structure of the sentence, not only the paragraph, not only the structure of the chapter, but across chapters. And so at every pause, at the end of the chapter and the beginning of the next, Sri Aurobindo briefly recapitulates the discussion before moving on to the next step of the discussion. But it is useful for us to review also the various stages that we have had to go through to come to where we are. In the discussion across several chapters, Sri Aurobindo had highlighted the importance from the ego and the various stages of that release, separating from the physical identification of the body, the separation from the life energies, separating yourselves also from your thoughts, eventually standing back even from your mental awareness as things that you take on but which are not you. And then the consciousness can turn back to its source, to find its merging in the self. In the nature, in the nature of the experience of that self, though, there are many modes. And there was an entire chapter dedicated to how the self can be known as in all its different aspects, in all its special facets of the quality-less, the qualitied, the one, the many, the active, the passive, and so on. And the goal given to us is the realization of all of these. And how are we exactly to realize that? And Sri Aurobindo points out that there is one mode of the self which is as if the common underlying reality of all these different aspects. And that is the experience of the Sat Chit Ananda. The way the self knows itself as pure existence, which is conscious, which is blissful in its pure conscious existence. of which and through which all these facets can be realized and experienced as one. But the human mind has a difficulty. The human mind is unable to enter into those states without losing itself. And therefore, one has the experience of a kind of a forgetfulness in a deep trance-like state where you may experience these things, but on return into the mind, at best you have a reflection. You do not know the thing itself in the mental consciousness, and while you're in the thing itself, you do not know the mind, and the mind is unable somehow to get free because it's the inherent limitation of the way the mind is formed. How then is it possible for us to have an integral realization where you can live in that consciousness and yet be in the world? For which Sri Aurobindo gives us a very interesting resolution by pointing out that within the mental consciousness there are further finer gradations of what may be described as the spiritual levels within the mind. And it is by entering in one of these that we are able to have the experience of that to whatever extent is possible in that consciousness and still be in action in the world. And that being the case, we are still left with one final difficulty, that the mind finds it difficult even in that to unify all these experiences into a single experience. In attempting to unify, it will always tend to pick one aspect over the other and tend to subdue other aspects in favor of one that you have chosen. The unification is its highest difficulty. How are we then to arrive at this integral realization? And he says, one way is to evolve stage by stage, taking each experience, widening your consciousness, deepening the experience, and rising in a kind of a slow process of inclusive growth. The other way is to shoot straight to the highest plane of mental being in which you can realize that pure self-existence, and from there becoming all existences, have a complete experience in which all these realizations can merge. And from there, once it is done, you may rise to still higher planes where the completeness is had in a supra-mental, higher than mental consciousness. And this is the process that Sri Aurobindo highlights here. After which, later on, he will show how from that height one regains the full awareness down through all the levels, integrating and unifying. But as a first step in this exclusive focus to realize pure self-awareness, pure existence in that, we have again an exclusive focus of the mind. You come to this silence, but there is still the gap between the movement of the universe and the silence. And he goes through the whole process of the various possible relationships and stages and how these could be stages, until finally we found ourselves at consciousness of silence, and from there we begin a process of integration with the world, seeing it not as a dream, not as an illusion, not as something split, but as an active power of consciousness. And the means is, while in that consciousness of pure self-existence, one becomes conscious of the consciousness of the self-existence and the delight of the self-existence. And thus we realize that that consciousness is what pours out as the creative power which becomes the multiplicity. And so the passive Brahman into which we have focused turns and begins to relate to the active Brahman, the world, and its origin are healed. There is no more this gap. This is the broad framework of what we have been following in the development of the sadhana, of what Sri Aurobindo has described as the yoga of integral knowledge. In the last portion of the chapter, he briefly discusses what the experience is like when such an integration takes place and the whole universe now is experienced as a living reality of one divine being, of whom these are two poles, the silence and the extreme of the activity. The next chapter is titled The Cosmic Consciousness, which is what we are beginning now. And in this, Sri Aurobindo takes up this poise of the united consciousness, describing first how it is to be made complete, how it is to be stabilized, even how it is to be acquired, the easiest means of acquiring, and then to make it complete and to stabilize it. What the experience is like as you deepen this. And then he discusses the relationship from that consciousness to the individual consciousness and the further facets which make this cosmic consciousness complete. He begins with what is a kind of a recapitulation. To realize and unite oneself with the active Brahman is to exchange perfectly or imperfectly, according as the union is partial or complete, the individual for the cosmic consciousness. So you will recall the last discussion was how from the poise of the passive Brahman one becomes conscious of the whole creation as the active Brahman. And increasingly, as this union becomes more complete, your individual consciousness begins to be replaced by the cosmic consciousness. Imperfectly, to begin with, growing to greater perfection, not a problem. But the process is gradual, having degrees, stages even of its perfection. But what you're doing here is, he uses this term exchange. Exchange the individual for the cosmic consciousness. Consciousness itself does not stop. You are still there, but increasingly you are replacing this awareness by that awareness. And the word exchange, why doesn't he say replace? The word exchange is important because what it does is actually, while replacing this by that, there is as if a swapping of poise. As we are today, we are in an individual consciousness, looking out towards a cosmic consciousness. When the exchange takes place, we are in a cosmic consciousness, looking in towards an individual consciousness. The individual consciousness is never lost. It is still there. So it's not like you're replacing this by something else which obliterates this. There is an exchange in your status by which you become more and more complete in the cosmic, and the individual becomes less and less your immediate identification, but exists there somewhere inside this whole. And this process of exchange can be gradual. It may seem strange when you think about it, but although they seem to be opposite to each other, the change itself can be gradual in two ways. First, that there can be a sense of a widening, gradually widening consciousness. And you still have this sense of a focal point of your individual narrow personality. And in the widening, that focal point seems to be less and less important. You may not even notice that there is a widening taking place. In a sense, this is what happens as we grow into maturity. As little children, if my toy is taken away from me, I may cry inconsolably. As a teenager, The same toy may not interest me. But my place in society, the respect I have from others, may be paramount. And then as I grow in age, in what we call becoming more mature, even that becomes less and less important. And if you notice, the fundamental shift taking place in you is you feel yourself more real than the reputation. You feel yourself larger than a name or an image. There is a kind of a widening, a kind of a freeing which is taking place. Very little. But just that is enough to change our perspective. We no more attach ourselves to little things. I remember still, it was a surprise for me the first time it happened. I must have been at that time about 9 or 10, and my mother was working in the library. I had gone to her room and I took a pen and wrote something, and the pen was so smooth. Immediately there was a feeling, and I said, "Can I have this pen?" And she said, "Okay." And she went on with her work. And for me, it was a bit of a shock. If I had that pen and someone had asked me for it, I would have had huge resistance because it is mine. It is so precious. It is so rare. And it was such a casual okay. She didn't mind at all that it was being taken away. And it was for me a bit of a shock. It provoked a whole introspective process. What it meant, the nature of the things which you like and are attached to. From a narrow consciousness, something wider is often a surprise. It's so free, so unbound. And so, as we grow in a normal human life, we are forced to widen, and it changes our relationship with the little things which used to bind us, and we have become a little wider. It's a very slow process, and the wideness then is also relatively small compared to the cosmic consciousness that we are referring to. But in exactly the same pattern, our consciousness can grow. We may not even realize, and sometimes because of the nature of the integral yoga, the transitions are so smooth. A couple of years down, 2 years, not more, suddenly you realize all your values have changed so much. Earlier you used to be so attached to certain things, and now somehow it doesn't matter anymore. Things come, things go, and you're no more so disturbed, you're no more so attached. And a kind of a calm base, a vast detachment begins to grow. You may not even realize that your consciousness has actually become wider, but it begins like this. A lot of this change initially takes place in our deeper inner layers, where the widening is most easy. The surface personality may still be somewhat bound in its habitual rut, but because this inner layer has become wider, its impact on the surface personality is a sense of detachment. But if we were more conscious of the inner layers, if we consciously grew in them, in this wideness, there would be a kind of a conscious enlargement which would obviously reflect itself, not indirectly, but consciously in everything, in all our relationships. How that is felt, Sri Aurobindo does describe later on, so we will follow that later. But this transition can be smooth, gradual. All through, you are still engaged with your focal point of activity. And so what has happened is, I was here looking at that, now I am there looking here, and an exchange. To realize and unite oneself with the active Brahman is to exchange, perfectly or imperfectly, according as the union is partial or complete, the individual for the cosmic consciousness. So as this union grows with the active Brahman, this exchange is taking place. I said there are two things which happen. One is this gradual widening, and there is the second, which is a kind of a double awareness. As you become more conscious on the inner layers, you're aware that there is this wider part, you're aware that there is this narrow part, and the two are as if coexistent. There are times when you are more in the narrow part, there are times when you're more in the wider part, and things in between. And that's where this identification is not yet perfect, but it's in process. Initially, you don't know why, you don't know how it happens, you're in this wider consciousness, and then one day you wake up from sleep and you're in this narrow consciousness, and you don't know why. You struggle. But after a while, a kind of a familiarity grows, you can even consciously shift your poise more into that or this. And that's when the sense of the exchange becomes more and more obvious. What is this narrow consciousness in relation to that? And he describes this. The ordinary existence of man is not only an individual, but an egoistic consciousness. So the phrasing is so precise. Our normal consciousness is not only individual, but an egoistic. Meaning you can be individual without ego. So to be individual is not a problem. The problem is when the individuality is egoistic. Again, he says egoistic consciousness, not ego. The difference is very important. Ego is the separation, the sense of separation, the sense of narrowness. Egoism is the constant reference to the narrowness as your priority, as your identity. So I have an ego, I feel myself separate. If a tiger comes, I need to preserve myself. To be egoistic is when I'm unable to recognize somebody else's needs, unable to adapt since I'm so fixated in my own narrow ego needs. Or the ego widens and it is my family, those who like me, who are my family, and therefore I'm good to them but not to others, and so on. It may take various sizes of ego. But the egoism is the reference constantly, and the egoistic consciousness is an awareness which is always viewing the world in terms of oneself. One of the most interesting experiences that we have as children is when we spin around. Extend your arms and turn, or you're on the merry-go-round and you turn. Initially it's fun because it makes you slightly giddy, but after a while you notice you are fixed and the whole world is spinning around you. You are the center of the universe. Feels very nice. Because it resonates with the truth that you experience. From your childhood, as you grew up as a little baby, the whole universe was running around you. You felt hungry and people rushed and pushed food in your mouth. You got a bump, a little pain, and everyone rushed to soothe your pain. It would be nice if that continued, isn't it? Is to continue that, not realizing that's not how things are. But this experience of being in the center and the whole universe whirling around physically, in your senses, you experience what otherwise in your psychology you are identified with. I am the center, everything is around me. This habit is so deeply rooted in the psychology, not in the physical senses, that we are unable to think differently. We are unable to live by standards which view others' values, others' priorities more than ours. There are people who have a developmental problem, and this is quite common in people who have grown up in very rigid hierarchical families, where they're taught to care for others more. And if you observe carefully, it's not a real widening of consciousness. It is more as if you've been programmed to think and behave like this as your survival. I am not me unless I am busy looking after others, unless I am busy serving others, unless I am fussing over other people's needs and ignoring my own. To look after my own need To accept even that I have a need of my own, one feels guilty. One enters a kind of a denial. It is a perversion of the individuality, but it is still an egoistic consciousness. A true freedom from the egoistic consciousness would see your needs and other people's needs as part of one whole. Neither embarrassed or afraid to face your needs, nor embarrassed or afraid to face other needs, experiencing the interdependence and the continuity of all these things as equally one. So the ego itself is quite complex and can take many different forms of perversions which may imitate an egoless or a wider consciousness. But one has to look behind the pretense and appearances. So he says, the ordinary existence of man is not only an individual, but an egoistic consciousness. So one could be an individual without egoism, where as a focal point one acts, but with a consciousness that sees everything equally and truly. It is that the individual soul or Jivatman identifying himself with the nodus of his mental, vital, physical experiences in the movement of universal nature, with his mind created ego, and less intimately with the mind, life, body, which receive the experiences. So now he's defining what exactly brings us into this experience, what characterizes this egoistic consciousness. So, first, there is an individual soul, Jivatman, which is not mind, life, body. But when it identifies with mind, life, body, experiences, then there is this narrowing, focus, fixating. So what is it that it is identifying in? In the movement of universal nature. So look at the whole universe and everything happening inside it. So let's take a picture, not only of the whole universe, the earth, a limited local society, and all the people, and within that, this one focal point of one individual in the larger community. Inside this one individual is the experience taking place, being registered in the mind of his emotions, of his body sensations. And this Jivatman, which is otherwise able to see all these equally, chooses to identify with this one, as if enter into it and look through its eyes, feel its body, feel its emotions and thoughts to the exclusion of everything else. Now the experience is literally this, that you're aware of everything, and even one can be aware of all the thoughts, all the emotions, all the sensations of all things in the whole movement of universal nature. And then you put your attention as if narrowing focus of awareness to this one. Highlight it, make it more intense. Identify with this more and more. You could still have the awareness of the other things, but you identify with this more and then forget the rest. The others fade out in the background until you are exclusively here. A very smooth transition. In fact, one can experience this very easily as individuals when we watch a movie or watch a theater program or listen to somebody narrating a story. So as the storyteller is narrating, he describes how he's on a ship and all around there is water. You do not see land. The wind is beginning to grow more intense, a loud howling sound. The waters are becoming agitated, the waves are rising, the ship starts tossing and turning. He begins to feel seasick. He's afraid for his life. There is no way to ask for help. Even if you called for help, nobody can come. And at that moment, he is wondering, what can I do? As you listen to the narration, your mind automatically enters into identification with his experience, bit by bit taking on the elements of the picture, of the senses, the sounds, the feelings, the emotions, the fears, the chill of the cold wind. And all of these are being entered into in an identification. That identification can be so complete that your physical starts shivering from the cold. You feel the hairs on your skin rise momentarily. Although right here it may be quite warm. And we've all had these experiences. It is as easy as this to enter into an identification. And if you stayed in it long enough, it could become exclusive because you forget yourself. In fact, that's pretty much what happens in our normal life. You will notice if you're traveling, often when you travel, you experience things much more vividly and intensely, as if for the first time. Because, well, it is the first time that I have come here and I'm seeing everything. I'm eating a food for the first time. Someone brings you a dish which you have never eaten. Here's a fruit. I think there's a fruit called a durian. It's a very intense smell. And someone places it before you and say, eat this. What do? You gingerly poke a few times, smell it, touch it, pick a tiny piece, put it on your tongue, and all your senses are at maximum focus. In case it's too strong, in case it's too intense, I will spit it out. And okay, it's not so bad. What is it like? And as if taken layer by layer the experience. At that moment, there is an exclusive focus on that experience. Having had that, you make a judgment. I like or I don't like. Once the judgment is in place, the next time that you eat the food, I like. Your intensity of awareness is much less. You put it in your mouth, I like. And then your conversation gets back. You forget the taste. After a few times, you're busy eating, you're not even registering consciously. Something inside you is aware your body likes, but your mind is elsewhere. Whenever you go out of your norm of routine, you experience more intensely. You come back home in your routine and you slip back into the habitual experience. You're not even aware. All the habitual programmings are what you slip into, and it's the same life, the same experience. You're not even engaged with things. It's very similar to this identification with the ego. I enter this, I fix in, and then I'm bound in its habit. I forget what it's like newly. But we can consciously break this. We can consciously begin to experience everything afresh. And already with that, you will find everything is different. Each time you eat the food, think of it as something you're tasting for the first time. It will be a different experience. What if you could extend this to all of your senses, all of your emotions, and even your thoughts? The first thing you will notice is you are not bound to the old habits of thinking. You're not bound to the old habits of feelings, of likes, dislikes, and sensations. You begin to experience, although through a focal point, but always afresh, always new. And at that point, you realize you, the experiencer, are not bound inside. Okay? So it's very interesting. Without effort, you live a normal life, you're sucked into identification and the routine of habit of sensations, emotions, thoughts. You can step back, disengage, and everything becomes afresh, new. What I'm pointing to is this exclusive focus is in fact so automatic, we do not even realize it. We need to make an effort to disengage. So, individual soul or Jivatman identifying himself with the nodus of his mental, vital, physical experiences in the movement of universal nature. Actually, all that is happening out there is all yours to experience. But you have focused on this narrow nodus of mental, vital, physical experience. What is nodus? The point where all three meet. Now, this is again a very interesting observation. In fact, when you step back a little bit, you notice your thoughts are different, your emotions are different, your physical sensations are different. When you enter into this narrow focus of identification with I am me, suddenly your physical sensations, emotions, and thoughts are merged into a single thing. I feel pain, which awakens anger, which creates thoughts at the same time. They are one. I step back and disengage, automatically the three become separate. I have thoughts which came in reaction to the emotions, which came in reaction to the pain, but they are different. I can stop the emotional reaction. I can change my thinking. But when I'm fully identified with this frontal me, physical person, body and mind are bound together. This is in fact the nature of what we use in the yogic terminology, outer nature, as distinct from inner nature. As you step back, there is a mind which is separate from the vital, the physical, and each having its own depths, its own distinct experiences. As you come forward in identification to the most superficial body consciousness, these three join and get rigid. To the extent that the three are joined, they are so interdependent that your mind becomes as rigid as your body. Your emotions change your body processes. Your thoughts affect your digestion. Your emotions create illnesses because the three are bound together. You step back and the three begin to disengage. Your thoughts are floating free. Your sensations are free. And at first it is disorienting because in your thought there is no form. In your emotions there is no form. In your sensation there is form. When I'm fully identified, my thoughts and emotions are one with the form. Here suddenly they're different and everything becomes a little vague, separate. So this term he uses is very suggestive, identifying himself with the nodus of his mental, vital, physical experiences. Where all three experiences join, that is your focal point. And that is the focal point in the universal nature, in the larger experience, which is all actually yours, which you have now ignored. And then he says, with his mind created ego, you're identifying with the ego sense created by the mind. Now remember, there are three ego senses. There's the physical ego, which is the part where your body experiences fear, like a visceral experience. When you lean down from the tall building and your body knows there is danger of falling, it pulls. You will see little children when they are taught to jump into the swimming pool from a height. They walk and suddenly they're losing their balance. If you've ever experienced this, all your muscles become unresponsive. Your legs just don't move as you come to the edge. I'm trying to take a step, but my foot barely moves half a centimeter. I feel as if I've taken a large step, but my foot has barely moved. My arms are frozen. And so the captain will say, jump, and you can't move your leg. You can't, the whole body blocks off. That is the physical ego. Its physical fear just blocks out who? Mind. I want to jump, I'm trying to overcome, but my body is not responding. It's very interesting to have this experience because you realize how dependent you are on the body instinct. When your body goes on strike, it can just knock out the mind's control, refuse completely, and you're helpless. Many people have this experience under stress, they freeze. And it's a term often used. It was frozen with fright or with stage fright. You come on the stage and you're supposed to perform for which you've practiced for weeks as a student. You stand there and your voice doesn't open, your mouth doesn't open, your mouth is dry and you're frozen. Your sense of time is warped. You feel frozen and actually a whole minute has passed. you do not realize. It feels like a few seconds in the intensity of the emotions. This is the physical ego. That's not what we have identified with. There is equally a vital ego. And then there is the mind awareness, which says, I am separate, I feel separate. And it is this mind awareness, mind ego, that we have identified with. Because we are primarily mental beings. The I entering to identify is in a mental experience much more than emotional or physical experience. If ever you tried to identify with an animal, there you would experience what it's like to be a vital ego and not a mental ego. If you have had pets and you've developed a close bond, one can have a glimpse of what this is like. You can feel their ego sense. It is not self-aware. It is much more emotional. It is emotion. It is identified with the emotional reactions and emotional relations. That would be the nature of the vital ego experience. So, with mind created ego, that's where you're focused. And less deeply with the mind life experiences. So we have the sense I, and then I have a mind, life, and body into which the experiences come, but I am this mental ego center. That's the focal point. So I'll reread the sentence and you see what he's capturing in the full picture. The ordinary existence of man is not only an individual, but an egoistic consciousness. It is, that is to say, the individual soul or Jivatman identifying himself with the nodus of his mental, vital, physical experiences in the movement of universal nature, with his mind created ego, and less intimately with the mind, life, body, which receive the experiences. For of these, he can say, my mind, my life, my body, my mind, life, body, regarding them as himself, yet partly as not himself, and something which he possesses and uses. But of the ego, he says, it is I. So the relationship with the mind, life, body in which the experiences are registered is slightly different. It's you, but not totally you. My mind is separate from others. My life, my body is separate from others. And yet, I can stand back from my mind, my life, my body. Who stands back? I. Who has my mind, my life, my body. So there's a in-between layer which is me and yet something I possess and not really me. Everything else is not me. This me has a center which is I, who possesses the mind, life, body, my thoughts, my feelings, my sensations. By detaching himself from all identification with mind, life, and body, he can get back from his ego to the consciousness of the true individual, capital I. The Jivatman, capital J, who is the real possessor of mind, life, and body. Now comes the immediate practice. Remember, you are aware of your mind, life, and body with this I ego. I am aware. If you disengage from all three completely, you get back to what is truly you. Disengage including from this I, which you feel is observing and experiencing. Because this I is in the mental awareness. Even disengaging from that, you become aware of the true individual, which is the real possessor of mind, life, and body. Looking back from this individual to that which it is, the representative and conscious figure, he can get back to the transcendent consciousness of pure self, absolute existence, or absolute non-being. Three points, the same eternal reality. One more step one can disengage from the true I, looking back. It's interesting when he uses this vocabulary, It is so precise as far as the experience is concerned. The first step is a detaching from identification. So it's as if I plugged in, I'm, I'm in it, and then I disengage and step back. And that experience is not unlike the experience you have when listening to the story. As the story is going through, often the trigger point is some discomfort, something you do not like, some experience which is too intense or painful, and immediately you tend to separate from it. You're watching a movie and it starts getting extremely violent, disturbing perhaps, or emotionally intense. The protagonist is going through severe pain of loss, loneliness, sadness, and I don't feel comfortable with that intensity. Immediately I disengage. And one of the ways you disengage is you start looking around at other people. How are the other people reacting? Oh, my neighbor is crying, somebody else is looking at their phone, somebody else is fully engaged. You see what has happened? I was in it, I step back, and I'm here. When I'm here, I'm not limited to this experience, I can see all the other experiences of the whole. So the first step is a detaching. You attach to yourself, you disengage, come back to yourself. But the second step is looking back from this individual to that of which it is the representative and conscious figure. And this experience is a looking back, something behind of which this is a special focus. The first experience is a separating from identification. So these are two stages you will find very suggestively in the Isha Upanishad, when the student or reader of the Isha is exhorted in the last two verses to recover his true spiritual identity. The text says, Om Kratos Mara, Kritam Smara, Kratos Smara, Kritam Smara, repeats. First the Om, which is significant. Krato is who is the doer. The Krato is the doer. Kritam is that which was done. So translating, you will say, Om, remember the doer, remember that which was done. And then again it repeats, remember the doer, remember that which was done. And the Om is the reminder, the all. So suddenly you remember who is the doer. I'm living my life, I'm identified with everything. And it says, who is the doer? And I step back. And from this poise, what was done? And I see my individual life from this individual consciousness. And again it says, who is the true doer? I step back once again into this wider, pure self. And what was done? The whole cosmos. So there's two stages of the awakening. In the context of the integral yoga, you will find Sri Aurobindo refers to this. First, the focus to recover yourself as the individual in the psychic center, which is the true person, the true person who chose to identify, who chose to take birth, who chose to enter this movement and grow in it. And after awakening to the self. And the self is transcending. It is unchanging. Even stepping outside space and time, of which the psychic being is a projection entering into space and time. So two stages of recovery, and only from there can you have real mastery. So by detaching himself from all identification with mind, life and body, and this was part of the discussion in one of the earlier chapters, he can get back from his ego to the consciousness of the true individual, the Jivatman, who is the real possessor of mind, life and body. And the relationship is, I possess the mind and life and body. You can discard them, you can possess them. And that experience of discarding is what we describe from the other side as death. But to the true Jivatman, it is just like dropping clothes and taking on new clothes. It is always there. Looking back from this individual to that of which it is the representative and conscious figure. So the relationship between that and this is that this center is representing that and a conscious form of that. What does it mean, representing? Representing means you are not that. And yet you carry its authority, its power, its consciousness. So when a representative of the king comes, he is carrying something of the authority of the king and the power of the king. He can sign on behalf of the king. To that extent he has the power. But he is not the king himself. Why? Because he is not the complete that. And so the relationship of this projection in evolution, the psychic being, with its source in the self, is this. While the self is outside space and time, unchanging, this psychic being is a projection of the self entering inside space and time. In the very act of choosing to enter space and time, it has a finite form. While the self is infinite and formless, its projection, its representation in space and time is finite, has form, and being finite, limited, has also the possibility of growing. Of course, it will never reach the infinite, but it can keep growing. In what? In its form, in its powers, in its qualities, in what it puts out of itself in capacity, potentially growing to infinity, because it is potentially still representing the infinite. If it represented a partial power, if you have the authority of the minister, you can only grow to what the minister offers you. But when you have the authority of the self, which is infinite and is infinite potential, then this representative can grow to infinity and with infinite potentiality. There is no limit to what we can become as this individual. The true individual. Imitating with fine form. The expression of that form can be infinite. It's a very interesting memory comes, only recently, it's fresh from that. Recently there was the Miss World contest and the Indian representative won it. The winning question was, what have you learned from being part of this pageant of the Miss World? And the girl said, I realized with this experience that I have the power to change the world. Very interesting. It's something we all feel. We don't always acknowledge because we never experience it in reality. But here was somebody on a world stage, and what she said, what she did impacted the whole world, and she felt that power. Now this is almost bordering on a spiritual perception, because this is the truth of our soul. And of course, because of that, the answer touched people. The truth of us is something within us has the power to impact the whole world, to change everything. Representative of that which is everything. It can bring its power to act in the world and impact. Silently, without anybody knowing, or even in some form of revealed action. We can see in history people whose actions have impacted the world. We remember them, we celebrate them. But if you look behind, it was often not the person, but a power working through the person. That even sometimes the people were not conscious of what it is that worked through them. If you ask them, how did this idea come? How did you get the inspiration? Oh, it just came. It was not me. Where did it come from? Obviously from the source, which is one with the world and therefore has the power to act on the world. These are the things which make life worthwhile, and they are the things which we remember in the history. Everything else fades away. So from this, the relationship of this individual is, it is a representative and conscious figure. In a sense, all of us are figure of the self, isn't it? Even the flower is figure of the self. The grain of sand is figure of the self. I, ego, am also figure of the self. Right? Except I'm not conscious. I'm not conscious of the self. I'm not conscious of that of which I am a form or representative. Unlike the inmost soul, the psychic being, which is, and that's why this wording is so precise, representative and conscious figure of the pure self. It is utterly conscious of its identity with the self and representing consciously in form a figure. Now, Sri Aurobindo uses the word figure. I have been using loosely the term form. And there's a reason for that. He does not say form. Form is how we will, in our mind, conceive of it. But a figure, like a sketch, represents in form but is not the form. So the psychic being, as it comes forward, enters the domain of space and time and therefore can be perceived as formed or limited in form, but is not itself bound to form. It is a figure and able to represent itself innumerably in forms. And that's why this precise term, figure. When you look carefully, every word in Sri Aurobindo's writing opens you to some insight. So, looking back from this individual to that of which it is the representative and conscious figure, he can get back to the transcendent consciousness of pure self. So when this awareness of this center looks back, what am I representing? What am I consciously a figure of? It is this that he gets back to. And the sense of getting back is in fact a very good description of the experience. Just as the sense of detaching is the first step, the sense of getting back. One often finds people who describe this experience as using the term leaning back into the self, or releasing, or kind of a relapse into the self from this focus. He can get back to the transcendent consciousness of pure self, absolute existence, or absolute non-being. Three poises of the same eternal reality. Now this part is condensing in a short statement a huge description you will find in the Life Divine. He goes into great depth with this. But there is one reality, capital R, that is the whole reality. And this reality can be known in three different ways. The first is what he describes as consciousness of pure self. Because as I step back into it, it is I. I am one. It is self, but capital S, distinct from lowercase self, which is my little surface awareness. So because it is my own identity, the word we use is self-Atman. The same, if you step back from this reference to I and look at it as the self of all things, and suddenly you find it is no more self, it is no more a sense of I-ness, it is only the sense of I exist It is pure existence. And so he uses the term absolute existence. Unlike all other existences which are relative existences, the flower can exist because of the tree which gives it birth, because of the water which keeps it alive, because the air which it has to breathe. Remove the air, you remove the water, you raise the temperature and it becomes ash. No flower. It is not really existent. It is only an appearance of existence. That is pure existence. It does not depend upon anything. What it is simply. Everything else in the movement is appearing, disappearing, not existent by itself. So the vocabulary here is absolute existence with a capital E. Absolute because it is not bound to relativity, is not bound to anything else. It is by itself, but also existence, capital E, meaning not the sense of existence we have where something exists because it was born, and if it is born, eventually it has to die. So existence is a partial passage between birth and death. That is simply no birth, no death, no relatives. Now you see the same experience, consciousness of pure self is that, but looked at it differently from the perspective of the universe, or even stepping beyond universe. Absolute existence. In the Buddhist vocabulary, it is this to which they point in the transition of nirvana. Nirvana is extinguishing the individual, the relativity, the changing surface. Poof, you blow it out like a flame. What's left? Absolute existence. And so they don't accept the word self. Not Atman, not self is how they see it. But actually it is just a different way of looking at the same reality, because reality is one. And the third, when that reality recognizes that nothing that exists, nothing that manifests, nothing of the relative view can ever capture it. When all sense of form, experience, or even awareness of itself is a limitation. It transcends that. It is beyond that. It is not being. It is not existence of any kind. It is non-being. So, not being unable. It is only again a third poise of the same consciousness, the same reality. That unknowable reality can know itself because it is real. And when it turns to know itself, it is this absolute existence. In the biblical narration, when Noah asks the burning bush, "Who are you?" "I am what I am." Sheer existence. And then that sheer existence is aware of itself, and so it is the self of the whole universe, can become equally the self of all things in the universe. But the same reality actually, three different ways of looking at it. Three poises of the same eternal reality. Now, this is important because Sri Aurobindo is pointing out to you, they are not three different things. They are three different experiences of the same thing. Reality is one, and that reality is eternal. But you can approach it in three different ways or know it in three different ways, all of which you must know. And there is a poise in which all three are known at the same time. The part of the reality, if we may use the term, the aspect of the reality which is non-being, the aspect of the reality which is absolute existence, and the aspect of the reality which is self-supporting and ending all existence. They're just simultaneously there. To the mind, one sees three, but to the experience as you enter into it, it's just, I can focus on this aspect or that aspect or the other aspect. But it's still the same reality. So what he has done so far in just 3 sentences, he has summarized discussions across several chapters and given you summary of ego to this absolute self, shifting through a passage in between of the true individual. And now he looks at something else, which is the linking to the previous chapter's discussion. But between the movement of universal nature, from which we have been disengaging, between the movement of universal nature and this transcendent existence, possessor of the one and cosmic self of the other is the cosmic consciousness. So, in front is the movement of universal nature. Behind is this transcendent existence. It possesses the whole universal nature. It is the self of universal nature. And then he gives to it other names. The universal Purusha, of whom all nature is the Prakriti or active conscious force. Now, looking at these two extremes of nature and this transcendent existence, we are looking at what bridges the two. There's this poise of consciousness, of which the power, the energy, is this movement. And this was really called the discussion in the previous chapter, where he bridged these two extremes. Power of the Purusha and the consciousness of the Purusha, universal, and all nature as Prakriti or active conscious force of this universal consciousness. And this totality is the cosmic consciousness. Now the picture in one single sweep is uniting all these different poises of consciousness in a single reality, one whole being. In this single reality and experience, you have the one, you have the many. You have the quality-less, you have the qualitied. You have the transcendence, you have the immanence. You have the universality, you have the individuality. Everything is there in a single whole. Just as a theme of meditation, this is something so complete. And you can see how when you live in a reality like this, it is possible to shift your attention to any of these aspects and get immersed in it. But each of these aspects is infinite. Each of these aspects is everywhere and eternal. And so one could get into one of these aspects and get so full of it as to forget the others. Which is what happens in the normal process of the sadhana. Depending on what is the alignment of your initial aspiration, you end up with one of these aspects, and it is so overwhelming, you stop and say, this is all. But here Sri Aurobindo, having discussed all these different aspects, brings them all into one whole. Here is the experience. In this cosmic consciousness, the individual is still there. The point in which the ego identified is also there. But you have also this poise of the freedom of the self and the in-between representation of the self inside the movement in evolution, which then loses itself in the ego identification. Everything is there, nothing left out. And this is cosmic consciousness. Now, this phrase cosmic consciousness, one has to be careful. Different people may use it in different ways. So one has to be careful when you read different sources of literature that what is it they mean by that term. There is a recent movement based in America where the founder of the movement, although familiar with Sri Aurobindo's text, has chosen to use the word supermind as a collective mind. That means when a group unites in a common shared mental awareness, like one person in a group, he calls it supermind. Now, if you did not understand what he meant by it, you could take a statement where he uses the phrase supermind and compare with Sri Aurobindo's statement where he uses this phrase, and there will be a problem for sure. In the same way, you may take somebody's description of cosmic consciousness. He attained cosmic consciousness, and you see Sri Aurobindo's definition of cosmic consciousness, They may not match. That may be a subset of this. Very often, when people have a first glimpse of some universality, they use it, they call it universal or cosmic consciousness. Sri Aurobindo is very careful in his vocabulary, and he takes care to define each of these terms. And he points out that one can experience universality on every level. At each level of existence, you can have the experience of infinity and even a glimpse of eternity belonging to that level. This is what often happens in certain experiences of the psychotropic drugs. People often now resort to ayahuasca and other types of drugs. They momentarily open your consciousness to something which is vast. Perhaps even the sense of time slowing down or stopping. But the glimpse is taking place at a level which is very close to the physical or the part of the vital which turns to the physical. And depending on the state in which you enter into that experience, you may enter the worlds of the lower vital hells or the higher vital heavens, and each of these will be as big as the universe or even beyond the universe, or so it feels. And it is true. But it is a glimpse only of that layer, and through that layer, in a consciousness which is bound and ego-centered, which is why you get overwhelmed, or depending on the nature of the experience, you may get sucked into a rush that whirls you all over the universe, and you find it overwhelming, and you're trapped in this very scary experience. But all of these are glimpses of one narrow point and its perspective of something which is a wideness of one narrow layer. This cosmic consciousness which Sri Aurobindo is referring to includes all the experiences, from the highest Satchidananda down to the lowest material universality, where matter itself experiences as one whole infinity, and everything in between is included. But this is a point liberated and complete, and so knows all these levels of universality as aspects of itself, layers, forms, facets of itself. Consciousness is the complete. Even here, who is experiencing this? In the beginning, there may be a consciousness of, remember what we discussed earlier, the higher parts of the mind which open to spirituality. In these refined states of mind, one enters into these experiences, and therefore one can have the experience with a waking consciousness. But because it is still, although refined, it is still mind, there is some inherent limitation to it. And eventually the experience becomes complete only when you are able to shift above mind into that consciousness of which mind is itself a representative, the supermind. How many are there? You could go on saying, but there's more, there's more. There is a consciousness which is the original consciousness of the One. The way the divine knows himself, his power of knowledge. That is what Sri Aurobindo calls supermind. And from our mind, there are a few gradations. And it is on those higher strata of those gradations that this experience is held initially. Once more complete, at the Sri Aurobindo will tell us, we can turn to the supermind and shift into its completeness, and that's cosmic consciousness becomes perfect and complete to our realization. But that's fine, we don't have to worry about that now. For the moment, at least one can have this experience, calling it reasonably complete, not yet perfect. So to arrive at this, we can arrive at that, become that, whether breaking the walls of the ego laterally, as it were, identifying oneself with all existences in the One, or else from above, by realizing the pure self or absolute existence in its outgoing, immanent, all-embracing, all-constituting self-knowledge and self-creative power. So again, this is summarizing a discussion previously in the beginning of the previous chapter, where he said you can grow through a process of inclusive widening, or you can go straight to the highest peak and from there recover the embrace with the whole cosmos. And he's reminding you of these two approaches. Both are possible. He refers in the previous chapter to this gradual widening process as the overall approach of the Vedic yoga. In our present evolution, it is possible to shoot straight up and acquire this much more rapidly. The framework of the Vedic yoga is applicable not only to an individual evolution within your lifetime, but it captures in its description the larger evolution of humanity across millions of years. And that's why it's so important. It is capturing both the overall collective evolution, which is a slow process, as well as the individual evolution done much more rapidly. In the experience, it describes each of the stages of the widening and including, and it's the same thing. The difference is in the individual, it is concentrated and speeded up, if you so choose. On the other hand, if we have come to this poise where we are now sufficiently developed as conscious mental beings who have a perception or a feeling of closeness with the divine presence, sufficiently refined to feel the reality of that, it is possible now to recover the slow process of the past evolution, but build upon it now by a rapid process of an exclusive rapid concentration, realizing the pure self or absolute existence, and from there know its outgoing, immanent, all-embracing, all-constituting knowledge and power. And so, which is the description of the previous chapter, you get the poise of the passive Brahman, and from there embrace the whole cosmos and the active Brahman. So we can look at these words because this sentence is so important. Look at each of these in a little more detail. So he uses two stages in his description. We can arrive at that, become that. So there is the first process of moving towards it, which is itself already so joyous. You're moving from completeness to greater completeness. Once you come to something, there is a part of you that has come to it, not the whole of you. Remember, your being is made up of so many layers, so many parts. It's like a flame rising. If you look at the flame, the peak is reaching high up, but it's a narrow point. There is also the base, which is needed for the peak to be able to stay. It is what is feeding everything else. So our human experience, the human personality is a bit like this. At the lowest base, we rest on the body. That's the wick of the flame. You knock out the body, the flame cannot exist. So you need that base. Around that is the immediate first burning experience, the heat generated, the light. And then from there, the higher rising, refining, and fading out almost in its refinement until you can barely see it. But that's where you have the most interesting experience. So our whole personality leans up, everything aligning, supporting ideally. And in this highest poise of our consciousness, in our deep concentration, we reach to some deeper experience, some wider experience. So there is this first arriving at that, and as we settle into it more and more, it is that now deepens in the rest of us, until the whole of us can begin to participate in it more and more. And it settles and becomes permanent. We become that. The more of us now is included in the experience, or rather, as the experience seizes the rest of us, we become that, and it becomes established. Two stages. We can arrive at that, become that. And then two ways he describes. By breaking the walls of the ego laterally, as it were. So what is your ego? Your sense of separateness. You remove that a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit, layer by layer. You will recall our initial discussion of what happens in life, grow a little wider. I am all that matters to me as a teenager. My family now matters to me in a first stage of adulthood. Except my family becomes now wider to include larger parts of society, the company I run, the people I'm part of, my community, my society, which nourishes me and to which want to give back now because it is myself in a larger extent. My humanity, my earth, and so on. It widens out. Although what we're describing here is only a very superficial widening. The deeper widening is in consciousness when the walls fade out. And the same thing which normally would take place in a maturing over 70, 80 years of life can get compressed within a single year sometimes. Suddenly, as the walls dissolve, all humanity, all life is my own larger awareness, my own being, my own family, whatever form it may take to the surface mind. But then it goes beyond that. Even the sense of opening to the universe, where things which are in the universe in the level of the mind or in the level of the life energies, all these become as if part of your own awareness. So the barriers are, the walls are of many kinds. The most physical at first, then the vital and the mental. Of these, interestingly enough, it's the reverse which follows. First the mind releasing because it's the most plastic, then the vital, and then the most physical layers in us. But it is the physical which is the narrowest, the vital which is the stickiest, and the mental which is the most plastic. So the knot of the ego, Sri Aurobindo points out, is in the vital, not even so much in the physical, because that's so sticky. In any case, whichever of these, layer by layer, in the mind, and especially in the parts of the mind which open to identification, one begins then to feel other people's pain as one's own. But unlike an empathic identification, where I will suffer because of the identification, you have here a greater sympathy, rather empathy. You feel, but are not overwhelmed by it, because your consciousness is wider. It's interesting in the way the whole reality is structured. In the evolution, you become aware of things only when you're competent to handle that awareness. You can experience the suffering of others only when your consciousness becomes wider. When you open these gates by force, prematurely, as happens in certain unstable states of either exhaustion, nervous destabilization, or certain drugs, then you are prematurely opening to something and it overwhelms you. In the same way, as you grow in awareness, you feel the awareness in things. With the awareness comes the ability to change the things. So it's as if your subtle senses awaken and grow, and your power to impact things directly on a subtle level also awakens. But in a consciousness which is no more egocentric. So there is very little scope for misuse, because you're seeing things differently. Whereas the same thing, if it was opened as an occult training, by an occult process, by some magical incantation or formula, you would have the power to influence or impact, but in a consciousness which is still egocentric. Inevitably, you will misuse the power. So in the spiritual development, all these things eventually awaken because they are normal aspects of the cosmic consciousness. But there's no question of misuse because you're living by a different standard. So in this widening, one experiences the suffering of others, but also from our poise of greater depth and freedom, one can influence that suffering and give them peace. As if taking away the suffering or infusing the peace inside. You find a state of disturbance and chaos. If you have the power, you can bring into it a peace and a light. You will recall Mother describing this when she was traveling on a ship There was a storm, and she was at that time with her teacher of occultism, Theon, and he told her, go and stop the storm. So she goes down into her room, lies down in her bed, goes out of her body, and she presides over that whole region, and she sees it full of little beings dancing around crazily. And they are the ones generating the storm. Now, when you read that description, the scientific mind within us gets a bit confused. Because we've been taught the storm is the result of the wind blowing because of temperature differentials and condensations and so on. And what she's describing is beings dancing crazily. The reality is this, that temperature differentials are only secondary processes. I will give you an example. For those of you who were here in that terrific storm we had, I think 2012, January. Yeah. Thane, yes, Cyclone Thane. It was an interesting experience. If you opened the window, the wind would pull it back and forth. Within a small space, there were whirls which were crazy, which created a suction and a push repeatedly. In a single second, it was shaking like that. Now, if you look at a gigantic temperature differential across 2 kilometers, which is causing a strong wind, you cannot explain these small whirls. And it was everywhere. You could look at a tree, and within the tree, each branch was moving easily in different directions, opposite everything else. It was not one wind blowing, it was everything shaking up, and it was so all over. And it is this which one recognizes on an occult level. Each center of chaos is like a conscious being in agitation. And then there is the gigantic being, which is the storm itself, which is the larger consciousness of all this group. Mother sees this on the vital physical plane. And then she said, I brought down peace and made them calm. And all the agitation of these beings softened, slowed down, and stopped until they were all peaceful. Now, these beings, remember, ego consciousness. Conscious only of themselves, they are the center of the world. They don't know anything beyond that. And so from outside, she brings this consciousness of peace, and they become peaceful, almost like automatons. And then she said, I came back into the body, I come back on the ship deck, everything is calm, the sea is silent, sky is clear. The storm is completely stopped. Now this capacity to intervene, this capacity to influence events in this way is natural for a consciousness which is wider, which feels all this happening and has access to a higher grade of awareness with which it can infuse into this. So the yogi sitting in the Himalayas can impact the whole world silently. You will never know his name, you will never know what he did, but the world is what it is because of the effort of a few who hold and influence things. Otherwise, you cannot explain certain kinds of events in history where things happened, where a whole people suddenly woke up, had this extraordinary courage or knowledge or inspiration of some kind. Everything suddenly changed because of that, and then they went back to their half sleep. And you look at the same people, the same culture, down one generation, it's gone. Where did it come from? What sustained them? Where did it go away? And it's only if you look behind to these powers which act that you can appreciate that it was an intervention which came. And you see this in India's freedom struggle, most freedom struggles across the world, in the French Revolution, and most such significant determinative events. There's always an action from above. Now, all of these are part of your domain of awareness in this cosmic consciousness. But as you grow, removing these walls laterally, you become aware of, and as a result also an influence and a capacity to influence grows. So he says, as it were. Now Sri Aurobindo rarely uses a term which is vague, so why is he using this? We arrive at that, become that, whether by breaking the walls of the ego laterally, as it were, identifying oneself with all existences in the one, or else from above. So why, as it were? Because the sense initially is you growing wider. Except it's not just a horizontal wideness, it is also levels of consciousness opening each time higher, higher. But the experience is in our individual consciousness distinctly the sense of becoming one with the universe. And it's as if walls on the side are breaking each time, even as the consciousness rises. So, slow process, identifying oneself with all existences in the one. Now, this is the key. What is the difference between the drug induced or the occultly stimulated, or now with brain stimulation, we can give you the same experience? Suddenly, you have this liberated experience. They call it now the, I don't know if you've heard about this. So you put on this helmet and they have these transducers which stimulate certain brain centers, and they've discovered there's a particular center in the brain which stimulated gives you the sense of transcendence. Suddenly I'm no more body. Suddenly time seems to slow down. I experience this sense of floating, wideness, oh, the whole universe, and I lose the narrow ego center. You don't need to sit for meditation and realize God. You just put on the God helmet. So it is not different from the drug-induced experience of some kind of expansion of universality. But the true spiritual experience is when you have a glimpse of the one, of which this is a part. And that's why when we do this by a conscious process of sadhana, of concentration in meditation, it is by focusing on the sense of all in the one. So two approaches. One is you begin by perceiving the one presence in all things and dwelling upon that, or directly going or following from this as a second step, all these things which had the same presence, after a while you realize it is one presence in which they all exist. And so you have this perception of the one who you do not know except from inside. Something vast, something immense, something present, immanent, everywhere. One in which all these exist. But which is all this? And that's where you have the progressive expansion of all this. Always approaching the one in which they exist. So identifying oneself with all existences in the one, that would be the process laterally. Or else, from above, by realizing the pure self or absolute existence, and from there, in its outgoing, that is from the silence of the Brahman, flowing out to become the multiplicity, outgoing, then immanent, living in all things, all embracing. So when it's living in all things, it's inside, but equally from outside it embraces, all constituting, it becomes all things, self-knowledge and self-creative power. So this description is also stage-wise again very significant. In the experience you have when you are in some poise, need not be the perfect pure self, but some poise even in the mind of a detached poise, silence of mind, or reflecting the sense of silence of self in the mind. You stay in that for a while, and then from there you turn. From there all this awareness is flowing out to become the world, to become these thoughts, to become these experiences and these perceptions. It's from the silence that it moves, and it is in everything. That's the first level of experience. Not only it is in everything, it is also containing and embracing everything from outside, nourishing, supporting. And then it is that awareness which becomes all things and is the very substance of all reality and all experience. This from the depth of the silent self, that's when you've embraced completely the active Brahman, as we saw in the previous chapter. So each of these stages is important. Outgoing, immanent, all embracing, all constituting. And then two things, self-knowledge and self-creative power. So first it is an awareness, a knowledge. But also after a while, the power of the awareness, what you're aware of, you can change, you can modify. So it is an awareness which leads the power to form, to create, and even to transform. So these are again two stages in which the consciousness grows. First you're aware, and with the awareness follows gradually the power to change and to even become. So one can at that stage initiate from there an awareness in knowledge and then a power which is an expression of the knowledge, and you release it and it works itself out in circumstances. In a large part, this was one of the forms of Sri Aurobindo's work in humanity, not only to realize and bring down the supramental consciousness, but in the process to form and imprint in humanity each of the stages of the development of the experience of the integral perfection without any effort by us as humanity. You find the mindset of people has changed, the values of people have changed, and the priorities are shifting. Everything in our education, everything in the media and its programming is against these changes. Education and our media teach us to be more selfish. And they're extremely powerful and organized influences which want to subjugate the human mind and bind us deeper into momentary short-term desires. And even to remain in conflict with each other, to become more egoistic. And yet in spite of that, in the last 60 years, human beings have become somehow more aware of the universality of the earth, conscious of humanity, thinking in terms which are global rather than selfish, perfectly, but much more than before. Transcending national barriers of identities, transcending other kinds of discriminatory barriers, the whole thinking has shifted. And somewhere within, there is this attempt to consciously improve oneself, to outgrow our limitations. It was not there so strongly before. It's all started after 1956. Before that, it was there in a few patches, but after 1956, it suddenly became widely, much more universal, much more spontaneously automatic in humanity. And all of this is the result of the spiritual imprint put out by this capacity that the consciousness has of the self-creative power. And this is the way the most developed yogis help humanity directly. So he's described two ways by which one can arrive at this cosmic consciousness. The first, which is a gradual widening and breaking of the walls, and the other by this realizing of the pure self and from there embracing it. But we come to some perception of the cosmic consciousness. What happens then is the rest of the description of the chapter. But in this you find the summary in what we have read today, one paragraph, the summary of the discussions of the last few chapters, leading you to a single, I will even use the word experiential vision of what is cosmic consciousness and the means to arrive at and become this in sum. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions.
You mentioned 1956
Yes.
That is regarding what?
So this is in 1956, the mother completed an effort which they had been working for, which was to bring down what Sri Aurobindo calls the supramental consciousness onto the earth as an active force in evolution. Just as a quick summary of what that means, there was a time on earth when animals were the only beings. There was not the human mind. Even if the human-like form was there in the ape, it was not self-conscious as a thinking mind. And in the evolution pushing up from below, that is the peak that has been reached. In order for thinking mind to awaken, there is a help from above, as if the power of a thinking mind is brought down and infused into the ape-like humanity. And so from above, a help, as well as an ascent from below, joining, made for the transition and the awakening of a new species, a new race of what we call self-conscious humanities, Homo sapiens. In the same way, in the human evolution, as we rise to realize the divine consciousness in its highest knowledge and power, there's a point beyond which our mind is unable to go. And we are stuck there helping, attempting and aspiring, and there is needed from above the consciousness descending to engage with this and complete the ascent. And part of the work, the most important part of the work of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, was to realize this consciousness of the supramental and embody it in their own mind, life and body in a way that would impact the whole humanity. And thus, connecting themselves with humanity when they embed this consciousness, it makes possible for all of humanity to be then taken up in its course, but inevitably over time to that realization. So in 1956, the mother was able to bring down this consciousness and as an active force in evolution working on earth. That's why I said after 56 it has become almost automatic. Before that you had pockets everywhere with this vision of something new, a new world, a new possibility, something by which we can grow and develop. They were pockets, or they were cut short in their possibility. After 1956, because of the action of this force all over the earth, there is as if a inevitable push forward. And it takes two forms. One is an attempt within us to grow, to know, but what is the form in which that is felt first? A restlessness, a dissatisfaction. Otherwise you don't yearn for something more, isn't it? So the first way we realize that we want more is when we realize we are dissatisfied with what we have. So there's a push, first recognized negatively, and then we try to fill that lack with other things, it fails, and we realize, oh, what we are seeking for is something more than just things and status and relationships. But that is the second side of it. So it takes two forms. One is this push forward, and the other is the insufficiency of things as the mind has organized them, reaching breaking point. And so it leads to as if a kind of a breakdown of the old order. All our structures of government, economy, social organization and values are found to be not only insufficient, but they're breaking down because they cannot sustain what we need. So we are clinging to these forms while they are breaking down, and at the same time we are trying to aim for something which is beyond these forms, but we don't know what form it will take. So there's this gap. We are in transition between two ages. While the old world dies, a new world is born, but the birth pangs is what we're experiencing. The child is neither in the womb in its comfort, nor in its independence outside the womb. Transition, and therefore painful, often chaotic in appearance. But if you're able to look behind, there is something in a pressure, sustaining, pushing. If you look ahead, it is inevitable. If you look in between, it's the passage you're seeing. For this reason, she created the space of Auroville as a conscious focal point where this transition could be made by those who are aware of what it means and how they can participate in it. And if somewhere on earth a group of people representative of humanity can consciously participate in the process, you are impacting the whole of humanity and making it easier for the humanity. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Yes. So one can see the utility of such means, such as ayahuasca, for people who are so stuck in the physical mind that they cannot even perceive that there's something more. You get a first crack, opening, breaking that, and you perceive, there's something more. If there is a deeper aspiration, it gets a chance then to push forward. I know of many people who, after having passed through an experience like this, recognized their spiritual aspiration and they didn't need any more the drugs. They went on with their spiritual path. But there are also the dangers when somebody is not ready for this cracking of their narrow reality, that the premature exposure may destabilize. And then one often sees the effect of that destabilization even in late age in life, even if they've had it exposed prematurely once. So it's always a tricky thing. One has to recognize the value of these things. But where possible, one should be able to move forward without the need for such forced cracking of your narrow reality. Ideally, the educational system would do that from the beginning. Because children have it already. You don't need ayahuasca to perceive the reality and the beauty of the universe, the divinity. You have it. Exactly, exactly, exactly. But because there's this phrase Sri Aurobindo uses, an asuric, he uses the word asuric education. The two things which have damaged humanity, he says, which has prevented the potential. I'm tempted to read from this, but we are short on time. He says, poor heredity. Now, what that does, it's interesting. The heredity is what gives you the physical basis. Now, if in your heredity there has already been a certain refinement of consciousness, in your physical basis there is already a perception and an opening. You'll find certain races that Sri Aurobindo refers to as being mystical. I think the Irish is one such, and the others, many such, in which the mystical turn has been so developed across generations that it has become a part of their imprint in the body. And of course, there are lineages within each race. But the point is, a good heredity would give you a strong physical base with strong nerves, a healthy vitality, and a clear mind, and possibly a deeper sensitivity. If you have that, everything becomes easier. If your biology is defective, your nervous system weak, your life energy is knotted up as part of the heredity, then the effort of potential is that much more limited, damaged. So, heredity is a great help. Second, he points to, is the Asuric education, which has damaged people. And I want to read from this portion. Let me take a moment to find it. So here it is. Okay. So he's speaking of the young children who are born. It was in the context of India, because he wrote this in 1909. Okay. He's speaking of, for the past few years in India, one can see as if a new race is being created. This same statement you can now generalize to the world, because it's happening everywhere in the world. Okay. As if a new race is being created, in the midst of the old, dominated by the gross influences. The earlier children of Mother India were born in an irreligious atmosphere or one of religious decline, and receiving an education in keeping with that, they had grown short lived, small, selfish, and narrow in spirit. Now, again, you can generalize this to the whole world over the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years. There's been this narrowing and selfishness and narrowing of spirit. Many powerful great souls were born among these people, and it is they who have saved the race in its hour of great peril. Remember, this was during the peak of colonial rule. Okay, so it was a huge struggle. But without doing work commensurate with their energy and genius, they have only created a field for the future greatness and the marvelous activity that awaits. It is because of their good deeds that the rays of the new dawn are brightening up all the corners. These new children of Mother India, instead of getting the qualities of their parents, have grown bold, full of power, high-souled, self-sacrificing, inspired by the high ideals of helping others and doing good to the country. That is why instead of being obedient to their parents, the young men go their own way. You see the difference in the old and the new. Now, I will say all of us, irrespective of when we were born, are part of this. The young men go their own way. There is a difference between the old and the young, and in deciding a course of activity, there is a conflict between the two. The old are trying to keep these youth, born of divine emanations, the pioneers of a golden age, confined to the old, selfish and narrow ways. Without understanding, they are trying to perpetuate the age of iron. The youth are sparks born of the great energy, Mahashakti, eager to build the new by destroying the old. They are unable to be obedient or submit to the laws of respect for the parent. God alone can remedy this evil. But the will of the great energy cannot be in vain. The new generation will not leave without fulfilling the purpose for which they have come. Now you will see this happening in the 50s, 60s, particularly after the Second World War, a lot of children with this tendency, but increasing now in numbers. Then comes the interesting thing. They will not leave without completing the purpose for which they have come. In the midst of the new, the influence of the old lingers on. Because of the fault of inferior heredity and an asuric education, many black sheep have also taken birth, and those who have been ordained to inaugurate the new age are unable to manifest their inherent force and strength. You see, they were ordained, they came for this purpose, but the damage from heredity and the damage from the asuric education have blocked that capacity. So they're unable to bring out that power, unable to bring out that light, unable to manifest. Among the youth is a marvelous sign of manifesting the age of gold. A religious bent of mind, we would use the word spiritual now. Remember, this was written in 1909. A religious bent of mind, and in the hearts of many, a longing for yoga and half-expressed yogic powers. Very interesting observation. If you watch carefully, you will see these tendencies. And Mother formulated this in this way. She said the special children with a new consciousness who are being born, there are two characteristics. One, they know exactly what they want. So as little children, 2 years old, they will tell you, I want this, not that. That's it. No negotiation, no wandering. This, clear. And second, they don't tolerate authority. And you see this pattern and you recognize, this is a conscious soul, unusual. But then the damage of the education. I know so many cases where children in their youth had all this opening to the inner and spiritual dimensions of life. And then they went through their teenage in the most numbing, destructive education, and everything is blocked. And you can see they are like robots. Especially so when the culture itself has become irreligious and against spirituality and the inner realities. It's very painful. So, in summary, it's a collision between two worlds, an old trying to perpetuate a new that's being born, and then in between the struggle. But I spoke of Auroville as a focal point in a physical space, but the spirit of Auroville is everywhere. You can be where you are in the world, and as long as you are in this alignment, you are part of this forward movement. And all this is because of the 1956 manifestation, which has changed the destiny of human evolution. Otherwise, we have had in the past attempts to break through beyond the mind and nature couldn't make it, and there was a relapse. And again this attempt. So when we read this text of Sri Aurobindo, he is describing the experience but also expressing the experience from that consciousness. It is as if he infuses the experience in us. And so we can hold what we receive. We'll continue the passage next Friday.